Hey guys, tonight we begin with wind. Cold wind. Northern wind. The kind that whistles through wooden holes and makes everything creak just a little bit more dramatically than necessary, so dim the lights. Get comfortable. Maybe imagine you're wrapped in something warm and mildly itchy, like a Viking-era wool blanket that has absolutely never met fabric softener. Tonight, we're floating gently into a question that sounds dramatic, but we will handle it in the calmest possible way. What happened to Viking women after raids failed? Because we always hear about the longships. The axes, the shouting, the beards that probably smelled like salted fish, and ambition. We hear about the men who sailed away, but we don't always talk about the women who stayed behind, and what happened when those ships did not come back. So, let's drift north. To Scandinavia, to the longhouses of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, to a world where your husband might leave for England in the spring, and possibly never return, and you just have to keep milking the cows. In the Viking Age, roughly 793 to 1066, raids were not just adventurous side quests, they were economic strategy, a seasonal business model. You plant crops, you tend sheep, and then, when the ice clears, and the sea behaves itself, you hop in a longship and go see if a monastery in Northumbria has anything shiny lying around. Of course, it did. Monasteries were essentially medieval vaults full of gold and poorly defended optimism. But here's the quiet part. Raids did not always go well. Ships sank. Storms happened. Local kings fought back. And occasionally, a very annoyed Anglo-Saxon militia decided they'd had enough of being politely pillaged. When a raid failed, the men might die, or be cut, or vanish somewhere between the North Sea and Regret and Bykommi. There were women. A lot of women. Let's meet one, not a specific historical person, because sadly, the sagas were much more interested in sword fights than in who churned the butter. But imagine a woman in western Norway around the year 900. Her husband has sailed west. He promised to return before winter. Of course he did. They all do. She is not a passive, weeping figure in a doorway. Viking women were not medieval porcelain dolls. They ran farms. They managed property. They controlled household finances. In many cases, they held the keys. Literally, archaeologists have found graves of women buried with large key rings, and in that culture, keys meant authority. If her husband did not come back, she did not instantly collapse into Victorian widowhood. She inherited. Under Norse law, women could own property. They could initiate divorce. They could control dowries. Compared to many parts of medieval Europe, this was almost suspiciously progressive. But that doesn't mean life was easy. If a raid failed, and large numbers of men died, the entire local economy could wobble. Farms needed labor. Protection mattered. Viking societies were built around kinship networks, tight, interlocking families who defended and supported each other. So, when men disappeared, the women stepped further forward. Widows might remarry quickly. Not because of romance. Romance was not exactly the central operating system here, but because alliances mattered. Land needed defending. Children needed fathers, or at least someone with a spear and a reasonably intimidating posture. And if you're picturing gentle countryside life, let's gently lower expectations. The Viking world was not calm. It was competitive. Status mattered. Feuds simmered, and if your husband died in a failed raid, your family's prestige might take a hit. Because in that culture, dying bravely in battle was one thing. Failing on a raid, that was less glamorous. There's a subtle social tension there. If a man died in glorious combat, sagas might remember him. If he drowned because the weather turned sour and someone misjudged the tide, well, fewer poetic verses. For the women left behind, that meant navigating not just grief, but reputation. Now let's float slightly west, to the British Isles. Because sometimes, raids didn't just fail. Sometimes, Vikings were captured. In places like Anglo-Saxon England, captured raiders could be executed, or enslaved, or and that ransom system is important. If a man was captured, word might eventually reach home. which meant his family, often led by his wife, had to gather resources for ransom. That could mean selling livestock, liquidating silver, calling in favors from relatives who might already be quietly tired of everyone's raiding habit. Imagine the awkward family meetings. Yes, I know, he said this would be the last raid. Yes, I know, he promised. Yes, I also remembered the last raid. But here we are. In some cases, if ransom failed, women might never see their husbands again. And here's where we add a gentle historical twist. Viking women were not only left behind in Scandinavia, many traveled on voyages too, especially during settlement expeditions. In Iceland, for example, which was settled in the late 9th century, women were crucial. Colonization required families, farms, stability. But raids that turned into failed settlements, that's where things grew complicated. Let's drift to the North Atlantic. Imagine a failed Viking attempt in Ireland. A group defeated, survivors scattered, so make up to raid women could be taken as slaves. And this happened on both sides. Vikings enslaved people extensively. They captured women from Ireland, Britain, and beyond. But when Vikings lost, their women could suffer the same fate. Slavery in the Viking world was bluntly transactional. Enslaved women called thralls worked farms, households, textile production, and textiles were serious business. Sailcloth required enormous labor. So did clothing for entire communities. If a raid failed and a settlement was overrun, women could be absorbed into another society entirely, which means some Viking women vanished not into death, but into assimilation.
They married, or were forced into unions. They raised children who might grow up speaking Old English instead of Old Norse. History rarely pauses to tell us their names. Now let's glide back to Scandinavia, because there's another layer here: power. Some women gained status when men died. If a local chieftain fell in battle, his widow could become a significant political player, at least temporarily. Saga literature occasionally hints at formidable women who managed estates, negotiated alliances, and even encouraged vengeance. Ah yes, vengeance. If a husband died in a failed raid, especially through betrayal or defeat by a rival clan, women could become the quiet engines of revenge. Saga narratives sometimes portray wives urging sons to reclaim honor, not with shouting, not theatrically, just a calm, steady reminder at dinner. So, when you're finished with that porridge, perhaps consider avenging your father. Very casual. But we should be careful not to romanticize too much. Saga literature was written down centuries later, often dramatized. Real life was probably less poetic and more muddy. Still, Norse law codes show women were not legally invisible. They could bring cases to court. They could demand compensation, called wurgeld, if a family member was killed unlawfully. So when raids failed due to inter-clan conflict, women might pursue legal settlements, which sounds bureaucratic. And it was. Medieval Icelandic assemblies, like the Althing, were full of legal wrangling. Imagine grieving widows attending outdoor court gatherings, negotiating silver payments for dead husbands. Not exactly the dramatic Valkyrie aesthetic modern pop culture prefers. Speaking of Valkyries, let's gently address myth versus reality. Popular imagination loves the image of shield maidens, women fighting alongside men. And while there is archaeological and textual debate, the majority of Viking women were not charging into battle regularly. Most were managing households, which, in a pre-industrial society, was not a small job. It was the economic backbone. When raids failed, the stability of entire regions depended on women maintaining food production, textile manufacturing, and social cohesion. So in a way, the real survival of Viking society rested less on axe swinging and more on competent domestic management, not as cinematic, but very real. Now here's something quietly sobering. Mortality rates were high, even without raids. Childbirth was dangerous. Disease was common. Life expectancy hovered somewhere in the 30s or 40s. So when raids increased male mortality, communities could become gender imbalanced. That imbalance could shift marriage patterns. Widows might remarry younger men. Young women might have fewer options if eligible men were scarce. Alliances between families could tighten or fracture depending on who survived. And sometimes, if too many men died in a single disastrous expedition, a settlement could weaken dramatically, which might invite more raids. History has a way of compounding problems. Let's gently move to Greenland. Yes, Greenland. The Norse settlements there, founded by Eric the Red around 985, were fragile from the beginning. Harsh climate, isolation, limited resources. If men died on failed voyages to North America, which they occasionally attempted, the remaining women faced extreme hardship. Archaeological evidence suggests that over time, the Greenland settlements dwindled. Climate shifts during the Little Ice Age didn't help. By the 5th-10th century, they vanished. What happened to the women there? We don't know exactly. Some may have died of starvation. Some may have integrated with Inuit populations. Some may have attempted to return to Iceland or Norway. History shrugs. And this is perhaps the most hauntingly calm conclusion. Many Viking women who experienced failed raids simply faded from record, not because they were unimportant, but because medieval chroniclers preferred kings and battles. The everyday resilience of women managing grief, property, children, and survival did not make for thrilling saga poetry. It made for continuity. So when a longship failed to return, there wasn't always dramatic collapse. There was routine. Cows still needed milking. Wool still needed spinning. Children still needed feeding. And in that quiet persistence lies the true answer. Many Viking women endured. Some remarried strategically. Some managed estates. Some pursued legal compensation. Some were enslaved when fortunes reversed. Some rose in local status. Some disappeared into other cultures. Few were immortalized, but they were there. Standing in doorways, counting the days, calculating resources, deciding whether hope was practical. And sometimes when winter came and the sea remained empty, they quietly accepted that the raid had failed. Not with cinematic anguish, just with the steady, pragmatic sigh of someone who already has tomorrow's chores planned. And that, oddly enough, may be the most Viking response of all. We'll let the wind settle for a moment. Now let's drift into something slightly more complicated. Because sometimes raids didn't just end in drowning or battlefield defeat. Sometimes they ended in capture. And capture meant negotiation. If a Viking raid went wrong in, say, 9th century England, local rulers did not usually respond with polite disappointment. They captured raiders. And the fate of those captured men varied depending on mood, politics, and how recently a monastery had been looted. In places like the kingdoms of Wessex under Alfred the Great, resistance became more organized over time. Alfred was not particularly fond of unexpected Scandinavian houseguests with axes. Captured Vikings might be executed. They might be enslaved. But they might also be ransomed. And here is where Viking women stepped into a very practical role: financial strategist. Imagine being the wife of a moderately successful raider. He sails west with confidence. He does not return. Weeks pass, then months. And finally, a trader brings word. He's alive, captured. They want silver. Now silver was not decorative fluff in Viking society. It was currency. Hacksilver, chopped up bits of jewelry and coin, functioned as everyday wealth. Many households stored it carefully, sometimes buried, sometimes sewn into clothing. Subtle, medieval savings accounts. If ransom was demanded, it fell to the family to produce it, and often that meant the wife. She would calculate assets, livestock, stored goods, textile reserves, silver hoards. She might call upon kin networks, brothers, uncles, cousins who owed favors. Viking society was deeply interconnected. Of course, there would be tension, because ransoming one man might weaken the entire household economy. Silver sold meant fewer resources for winter trade, fewer assets for daughters' dowries, fewer reserves if famine struck. So these decisions were not emotional outbursts. They were cold, measured assessments. Is he worth it? That sounds harsh. But medieval survival often was. If a husband had a history of one last raid, perhaps patience wore thin. If he was a respected leader, ransom might be immediate. If he was, politely put, enthusiastic but incompetent, the conversation might stretch. We do have scattered historical examples of ransom practices across Viking and Anglo-Saxon interactions. Later, during the reign of Fellard the Unready, enormous sums of Danegeld were paid to Viking forces to stop raids. Entire kingdoms negotiated with invaders. So imagine smaller, more personal versions of that same system playing out quietly across the North Sea. Now let's turn the lens slightly. Because sometimes it wasn't the men being ransomed. When Viking settlements were attacked, especially in contested regions like Ireland, women could be taken captive. The Norse established major settlements in places like Dublin during the 9th century. It became a thriving Norse Gaelic hub. Trade, slavery, craftsmanship. It was not just a raiding outpost, it was a city. But Irish kings did not exactly roll out welcome mats. Conflicts erupted, battles were fought, and sometimes Viking communities lost. When that happened, women might be captured by Irish forces. Some would be enslaved. Others might be integrated into local households through marriage arrangements. Here is where the story becomes less cinematic and more quietly transformative. Over generations, Norse and Gaelic populations blended. Archaeology shows hybrid cultural patterns. Norse-style jewelry buried alongside Gaelic artifacts, language mixed, names blended. So for some Viking women whose raids or settlements failed, their story did not end in tragedy, it shifted. They might raise children who spoke Old Irish, they might adopt local dress, they might maintain fragments of Norse identity within new communities. History does not give us their diaries. But DNA studies and material culture suggest assimilation was common. And then there's Iceland. Let's float west again gently. Iceland's settlement, beginning around 874, was not primarily about raiding. It was about escape. Political disputes in Norway under King Harald Fairhair pushed families outward. But even Iceland was not immune to conflict. Early Icelandic society was structured around powerful chieftains. Feuds erupted, legal disputes escalated. If men died in failed power plays, women once again stepped into the delicate balance between revenge and legal resolution. The Icelandic Althing, established around 930, was one of the world's earliest parliamentary assemblies. While women did not hold official political office, they could influence proceedings through male relatives and through property claims. Saga literature, written later but reflecting earlier traditions, occasionally portrays women urging settlement or vengeance with calm intensity. Take, for instance, figures in the family sagas like those recorded in the Gjoll saga. Women are not passive decorations. They advise, they provoke, they calculate. Sometimes they escalate feuds. Sometimes they attempt to restrain them. And if a raid or expedition ended badly, leaving a widow with sons, her influence could shape the next generation's decisions, raise them toward diplomacy or toward reclaiming honor. Both options existed. Now we should pause and address something modern pop culture loves: the dramatic warrior widow. The woman standing on a cliff, vowing revenge to the crashing sea. It's a powerful image, very cinematic, very soundtrack friendly. But real Viking society was more bureaucratic than blockbuster. Wergeld, compensation payments for wrongful death, was a formal legal concept. If a man was killed unlawfully, his family could demand payment. And if payment was refused, then feuds might ignite. So when raids failed because of inter-clan conflict, widows might spend years navigating compensation systems. Imagine the patience required. Attending assemblies, presenting claims, waiting for judgments, arguing over the precise silver value of a human life. It was not glamorous, but it was structured. Now let's talk about remarriage. In Viking society, remarriage was common, especially for widows. Marriage was alliance, it was land consolidation. It was survival strategy. A widow with property was not socially invisible. She was economically significant. If her husband died on a failed raid, she might attract suitors quickly. Particularly if she controlled farmland. Romance? Possibly. But stability mattered more. And here's a quiet irony. Failed raids sometimes strengthened women's relative autonomy. When men were absent, dead, captured, or missing, women ran estates fully. They negotiated trade. They oversaw seasonal labor. They managed thralls. This was not theoretical empowerment. It was necessity. And necessity can quietly reshape norms. Archaeological graves in Scandinavia occasionally show women buried with keys, scales for weighing silver, and high-status goods. Not because they were decorative companions, but because they held authority. Still, we must not drift too far into idealization. Viking society was patriarchal. Women's power often depended on kinship structures. Violence and coercion existed. Slavery was common. If a community collapsed after a disastrous raid, vulnerable women, especially thralls, suffered most. Thralls had few protections. If their masters died, they could be sold, reassigned, traded. For elite women, failed raids were strategic crises. For enslaved women, they were existential threats. Now let's take one last slow glide across the North Sea. By the late 10th and early 11th centuries, Viking raids began shifting into conquest. Large armies invaded England. Kings like Canute the Great eventually ruled vast territories. But even during these expansive campaigns, not every expedition succeeded. When armies were defeated, families back home felt the shockwaves. Entire regional power structures could collapse if leading men died. And in those moments, women often became temporary anchors of stability. They arranged new marriages, secured alliances, preserved land claims for sons who were still too young to wield authority. In some cases, they retreated from political prominence entirely, focusing inward on household survival. In others, they maneuvered skillfully through shifting hierarchies. History rarely spotlights them. But without them, Viking society would not have endured long enough to leave such a loud mark on European history. So what happened to Viking women after raids failed? They calculated, they negotiated, they endured capture. They endured widowhood, they remarried, they litigated, they assimilated. They kept spinning wool while the geopolitical chessboard shifted around them. Not glamorous, not dramatic, but deeply resilient. And as the sea outside our imaginary longhouse finally quiets, we'll let that image settle. Because next, we'll drift into something even more understated. What happened to the children of those failed raids? The ones who grew up in households shaped by absence.
Let's lower the fire just a little more. The longhouse is quieter now. The wind hath softened into that steady northern hum. Somewhere, a child is half asleep under layers of wool that absolutely itch, but no one is complaining because it is the year 900 and comfort is negotiable. Tonight, we drift toward the children. Because when raids failed, it wasn't just wives who absorbed the impact. It was sons. It was daughters. It was toddlers who would grow up never quite remembering a father's face. And Viking childhood was not exactly soft-focused nostalgia. In a farming society, children worked early. Boys learned to manage livestock, repair tools, handle boats. Girls learned textile production, which, just to be clear, was industrial-scale labor disguised as domestic activity. Weaving sailcloth was a monumental task. Entire households could revolve around it. If a father died in a failed raid, sons inherited more than land. They inherited expectation. Imagine a 10-year-old boy in coastal Norway. His father left in spring. Word comes in autumn that the ship was lost off the coast of Scotland. There is no body, just rumor. Now the boy grows up in a household shaped by absence. His mother manages the farm. His uncles advise, his grandmother mutters about omens, but socially, he carries something heavy on her. Viking society revolved around reputation. If a man died bravely in battle, that was one thing. But if the raid failed through miscalculation, bad leadership, or simply misfortune, the story might carry an edge. And children hear those edges. They absorb the tone at feasts, the careful way neighbors phrase condolences, the slight pause before someone says, "He was ambitious." Ambitious. So, sons of failed raiders often grew up determined to correct the narrative, which meant gently more raiding, because of course it did. Cycles of honor are rarely self-extinguishing. In Iceland, where many families traced their lineages meticulously, sagas later recorded multi-generational feuds. A fatardjes, a son grows up, a revenge claim simmers for decades. Take the world reflected in Egil's saga. While dramatized, it portrays how personal honor and family memory shaped behavior across generations. Children did not simply move on. They were raised inside stories. Stories of triumph. Stories of humiliation. Stories of unfinished business. Now let's shift slightly. Because not every failed raid ended in death. Sometimes fathers were captured and never returned. Sometimes they chose not to return. Yes, let's address that quietly uncomfortable possibility. Some Viking men who sailed west settled elsewhere, particularly in places like York, known in Norse as Gjorvik, which became a major Viking center in England during the 9th and 10th centuries. A failed raid could become a successful relocation. Which means, back in Scandinavia, wives and children might wait for men who had adjusted their plans. Without modern communication, ambiguity lingered. Was he dead? Captured? Starting a new life with better farmland and fewer responsibilities. The uncertainty shaped childhood. Growing up without closure creates a different emotional climate than growing up with confirmed loss. Children might maintain hope for years. A return that never comes. A knock at the door that never sounds. Now, let's consider daughters. Because sons inherited honor, yes, but daughters inherited strategy. In societies where marriage was alliance, daughters were political assets. If a father died in a failed raid, his daughter's marriage prospects might shift. If the family's prestige declined, suitors might come from slightly lower-ranking households. If the widow managed the estate skillfully and maintained wealth, the daughter's prospects might remain strong. Girls grew up observing their mothers navigate widowhood. They learned negotiation, resource management, emotional restraint. Viking literature sometimes portrays strong female figures, not because they wield swords, but because they wield influence. And daughters of failed raids would have understood early that stability was fragile. They watched silver hoards being counted, livestock tallied, debts discussed. They learned that a single disastrous expedition could alter the trajectory of a family for decades. Now let's float west again, gently, to the Norse settlements in Greenland. When expeditions from Greenland to North America, what we now call Vinland, faltered. Those who returned sometimes brought stories of hostility, limited resources, and fragile outposts. The saga accounts, such as those preserved in the Saga of the Greenlanders, describe attempts at settlement that ultimately did not endure. For children growing up in Greenland's harsh climate, failed voyages meant tighter resources, fewer trade goods, increased isolation. If fathers died on exploratory missions, communities already on the edge became more vulnerable. And children learned resilience very quickly. They learned to ration dut, to adapt, to accept that not every bold idea resulted in success. Now, we should pause and acknowledge something quietly human. Grief in the Viking world did not look like modern therapy sessions. It looked like work. It looked like continuity. Burials could be elaborate. Ship burials, grave goods, memorial stones. But once rituals concluded, survival resumed. Children who lost fathers did not receive extended childhoods of mourning. They entered adulthood sooner. A teenage boy might become head of household earlier than expected. A young girl might be married slightly earlier to secure alliances. There is a sobering efficiency to it. Now, let's consider another possibility. Sometimes, failed raids resulted in fathers returning, but diminished injured, defeated, financially ruined. Imagine a man who returns not with silver, but with scars and debt. Children grow up, observing that, too. A father who once embodied boldness, now quieter. Perhaps resentful, perhaps withdrawn. Household dynamics shift. In societies built on martial success, visible failure could strain authority. And children are perceptive. They sense tension in conversation, the way their mother handles negotiations more frequently, the way uncles step in during disputes. So the impact of failed raids was not always dramatic tragedy. Sometimes it was slow adjustment. Now, let's gently address something darker, but calmly. If Viking settlements abroad were attacked and overrun, children could be captured along with women. Archaeological and textual evidence confirms the widespread slave trade in the Viking world. Enslaved children were valuable, adaptable, trainable. So, some children of failed raids were absorbed into foreign societies entirely, raised speaking Old English or Old Irish, or Slavic languages if captured in Eastern campaigns. Their Norse identity faded within a generation, and history did not record their names. But genetics quietly did. Modern DNA studies show Norse ancestry scattered across the British Isles, Ireland, and parts of Eastern Europe, which means some children of failed raids did not disappear. They transformed. Now, let's circle back to Scandinavia one more time. What long-term cultural effect did these cycles create? A society accustomed to absence, seasonal departures, uncertain returns, risk as routine. Children grew up expecting instability. And perhaps that normalized it. When you grow up watching ships vanish every spring, you internalize you learn not to anchor identity too tightly to certainty. There is something almost stoic in that. Not theatrical, just practical. And so, the children of failed raids became the next generation of farmers, traders, explorers, and yes, sometimes raiders, but perhaps with slightly sharper calculations, slightly more caution, or, occasionally, slightly more recklessness. Because if your father failed, maybe you could succeed, or maybe you decided farming was safer but a pin. By the late Viking Age, many Norse societies shifted gradually toward more stable kingdoms and Christian governance. Raiding declined. Trade expanded. The world changed. And those children, shaped by loss, negotiation, adaptation, were part of that transition. So what happened to them? They grew up. They inherited unfinished stories. They adjusted. Some chased glory. Some sought stability. Some disappeared into other cultures entirely. But none lived untouched by the quiet consequences of failed ambition. And as the wind outside finally settles into near silence, we'll let that generational echo fade softly. Because next, we'll drift into something even what happened to the communities themselves when too many raids failed, when entire regions felt the weight of repeated loss.
Let's settle back in. The night feels deeper now. The fire is mostly embers. The longhouse smells faintly of smoke, wool, and whatever has been simmering for the last 6 hours. Outside, the shoreline is quiet, suspiciously quiet. The kind of quiet that suggests either peace or a collective decision not to talk about something. Tonight, we're not focusing on one woman or one child. We're zooming out, because when raids failed occasionally, that was manageable. Annoying, yes. Financially inconvenient, certainly, but survivable. When raids failed repeatedly, that's when the entire community started to shift. Viking societies were tightly woven. Farms were not isolated units. They were part of kin networks. Extended families clustered geographically. Alliances were reinforced through marriage. Labor was shared seasonally. If one household lost a man, neighbors absorbed the shock. If 5 households lost men in a single disastrous expedition, now we have a problem. Let's imagine a fjord in western Norway around the mid-10th century. A respected local chieftain organizes a large raid to the British Isles. Several ships leave. Spirits are high. Promises of silver circulate freely. Only one ship limps back. Word spreads slowly, then fully. There are no dramatic announcements, just absence. And absence has weight. Economically, the immediate effect was labor shortage. Viking farming was labor-intensive. Hay had to be cut and dried before winter, livestock managed, fishing maintained, timber processed. If too many adult men vanished, the strain fell on women, elderly men, adolescents, and thralls. Communities adjusted, of course. Humans always do. Women took on heavier management roles. Younger boys assumed adult responsibilities earlier. Kin from nearby settlements might rotate assistance. But repeated failures created subtle long-term consequences. First, reduced surplus. Raiding was not only about glory. It injected silver and goods into local economies. Imported textiles, weapons, and luxury items elevated status. Silver fueled trade. Without successful raids, wealth accumulation slowed. And in a society where status was visible, displayed through jewelry, feasts, gift-giving, diminished wealth translated into diminished influence, which could destabilize leadership. If a chieftain led repeated failed expeditions, his authority weakened. Because in Viking culture, leadership was partly elective. Followers chose to align with strong leaders. Weakness could shift loyalties. So communities experiencing repeated failures might see internal power reshuffling. Now let's float west again to the Danelaw region of England, areas under Norse control during the 9th and 10th centuries. Places like York were not just raiding bases. They were urban centers, trade hubs. But military defeat could ripple backward. When Anglo-Saxon kings like Edward the Elder began reconquering territories in the early 900s, Norse communities in England lost political ground, which meant Scandinavian homelands lost influence and potential wealth streams. Families back home felt those shifts. Fewer trade links, less silver flow, less prestige tied to overseas kin. Communities that had leaned heavily into expansion suddenly needed to stabilize internally. And stabilization meant something almost boring: agricultural focus. Trade networks that did not involve burning monasteries. Gradual Christianization. Yes, let's talk about that gently. Repeated failed raids and shifting political realities coincided with the gradual spread of Christianity across Scandinavia. Kings like Olaf Tryggvason actively promoted conversion around the year 1000. Later, rulers reinforced it. Conversion was not just spiritual. It was political alignment with broader European systems. And here's the interesting community-level effect. As raiding became riskier and less profitable, Christian trade networks became more attractive. Communities that once celebrated seasonal violence slowly reoriented toward stability. Not overnight, but steadily. And Viking women, the managers of households, were central to that shift. Because religious conversion often moved through family structures, mothers influenced children's upbringing. Domestic rituals adapted first. If raids failed often enough to make expansion less appealing, households might quietly prefer predictability. It's hard to romanticize failure when you have crops to protect. Now let's talk about morale. In small, tightly bonded societies, repeated collective loss changes atmosphere. Feasts become smaller. Boasts become cautious. Young men grow up hearing not just tales of triumph, but stories of ships that never returned. Communities might develop informal risk assessments. Perhaps fewer ships launched each spring. Perhaps expeditions were shorter. Perhaps trade voyages replaced deep inland raids. Risk tolerance is cultural, but it's also responsive to outcome. If enough ventures fail, even bold societies recalibrate. And here's something quietly fascinating. By the late Viking Age, many Scandinavian societies were transitioning into more centralized kingdoms. Raiding did not disappear entirely, but it became less the primary economic engine. Part of that shift likely reflects simple cost-benefit analysis at the community level. Too many failed raids. Too much instability. Time to try something else. Now let's gently acknowledge something less tidy. Not every community adjusted smoothly. Some regions likely experienced sharp decline. If a settlement was marginal, poor soil, limited trade access, and multiple expeditions failed, families might relocate. Internal migration within Scandinavia increased during the Viking Age. People moved toward more fertile areas, toward trade hubs, toward emerging political centers. So failed raids did not just produce widows and fatherless children. They reshaped population distribution. And women were often at the center of relocation decisions. If a widow controlled property but faced declining prospects, she might remarry into a stronger district, bringing land, livestock, and alliances with her. Marriage became not just personal recovery, but regional redistribution. Now let's return briefly to Greenland. By the 14th century, the Norse Greenland settlements were struggling severely. Climate cooling reduced agricultural viability. Trade with Europe declined. If exploratory or trading voyages failed repeatedly, communities became more isolated. And isolation compounds hardship. Archaeological evidence suggests gradual decline rather than sudden catastrophe, which means generation after generation adapted downward. Fewer resources, simpler lifestyles, tighter survival margins. And within that contraction, women's labor would have intensified. Textiles remained critical, food preservation more urgent, social cohesion more essential. Failed expeditions in such fragile environments could tip entire settlements toward collapse, which eventually they did. And again, history leaves us with silence rather than spectacle. Now let's drift back to Scandinavia one last time tonight. Picture a coastal village in the early 11th century. Christianity is spreading. Trade networks are formalizing. Royal authority is strengthening. The era of small-scale independent raiding bands is waning. The community remembers decades of seasonal departures. Some triumphant, some disastrous. The women who once stood on shorelines counting ships are older now. Their daughters have married into more stable arrangements. Their sons may serve emerging kings rather than freelance chieftains. Raiding has not vanished, but it is no longer the default economic rhythm. And perhaps, just perhaps, repeated failure helped nudge that evolution. Because nothing encourages institutional stability quite like expensive mistakes. So what happened to Viking women when raids failed repeatedly across entire communities? They became anchors. They absorbed economic shocks. They recalibrated alliances. They adapted domestic practices to shifting religious and political realities. They endured cycles of boom and loss without ever being the headline. And in doing so, they quietly carried their societies through transformation. No dramatic speeches. No cinematic revenge arcs. Just steady management of reality. Which, in the long arc of history, may be more powerful than any successful raid. And as the embers fade to almost nothing, we'll let the village settle into sleep. Because in our final part, we'll step back entirely. We'll look at how memory, sagas, archaeology, modern myths remembers these women. Or forgets them. The fire is nearly gone now, just a soft orange glow. The kind that makes everything look gentler than it really is. The village is asleep. The cows are quiet. The sea is behaving for once. And we are left with something oddly modern. Memory. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. We know far less about Viking women after failed raids than we know about almost anything involving a sword. Battles get recorded. Kings get carved into stone. Victories get exaggerated. But the woman who counted the livestock after 3 ships didn't return? She gets a key in a grave. Maybe. Let's float into that quiet gap between legend and reality. When we think about Vikings today, pop culture hands us 2 main images of women. First, the weeping wife in a doorway. Second, the fully armored shield maiden, hair flowing in slow motion, dramatically defying gravity and common sense. Reality, as usual, is less theatrical. The majority of Viking women lived in the middle space. They were neither fragile ornaments nor constant battlefield commanders. They were administrators, agricultural managers, textile producers, legal participants, survivors, and when raids failed, they were the ones who stitched the economic fabric back together. But why don't we hear more about them? Because most written sources about the Viking Age were produced later, often by Christian chroniclers or Icelandic saga writers. Take the great saga compilations like Heimskringla, attributed to Snorri Sturluson. These works are invaluable. They preserve genealogies, battles, political drama. But they were written centuries after many of the events they describe. And they were written by men deeply interested in kings, feuds, and spectacular deaths. Daily economic management? Less thrilling. Widow negotiating ransom logistics? Hardly saga material. So the women who absorbed the consequences of failed raids were often edited into the margins. Occasionally, though, they slipped through. A widow urging her sons to reclaim honor. A wife refusing to hand over property without proper legal compensation. A woman orchestrating a politically advantageous remarriage. These glimpses matter, but they're fragments. Which brings us to archaeology, the quieter storyteller. Burial sites across Scandinavia reveal women interred with keys, scales, high-quality textiles, jewelry, and sometimes even boats. Keys are especially symbolic. They represented household authority, control over storage, over wealth. In a society where raids injected silver into the economy, the person managing that silver at home held real power. And when raids failed, the same person managed scarcity. Archaeological finds at trading centers like Birka show extensive textile production and evidence of female economic activity. Textiles were currency adjacent. They were trade goods. They were essential to shipbuilding. Sails required enormous woven surfaces, which means women's labor literally powered raiding infrastructure. So when raids failed and fewer sails were needed, textile production may have shifted toward trade or domestic stability. These are the quiet adjustments history doesn't dramatize. Now let's address the modern myth gently. In recent decades, interest in shield maidens has grown. Some archaeological finds, including high-status warrior graves, have sparked debate about women participating directly in combat. And while it's possible that some women fought, the broader societal pattern suggests that most power exercised by women was domestic, legal, and economic, which frankly is less flashy but more structurally important. If failed raids destabilized a community, the women maintaining continuity prevented collapse. Not glamorous, but foundational. Now let's drift toward something slightly bittersweet. Over time, as Christianity spread across Scandinavia, cultural narratives shifted. Raiding became less central to identity. Kings consolidated power. Written record-keeping increased. Women in Christian Scandinavia still held property rights in many cases, but social roles slowly adjusted under new religious frameworks. And the memory of the Viking Age became stylized. Bold warriors, adventurous explorers. The quieter reality that for every successful expedition, there were anxious households recalculating survival, softened into background noise. Modern fascination with Vikings often leans into spectacle. But when you look closely at settlement patterns, inheritance laws, and demographic data, a different story emerges. One of adjustment. Of women remarrying not out of romance, but strategy. Of children growing up with incomplete stories. Of communities gradually shifting away from high-risk expansion because the cost was too high. And here's something quietly ironic. The endurance of Viking culture, its survival long enough to transition into medieval Scandinavian kingdoms, likely depended more on women's stability than men's raids. Because you can only lose so many ships before someone sensible says, perhaps we try trade this year, and that someone was probably managing the pantry. Now let's step even further back. What does this all mean? It means that failed raids were not just isolated disasters. They were stress tests, tests of kinship networks, of economic flexibility, of legal systems, of emotional resilience. And Viking women were central to passing those tests. Some were widowed and remarried into new alliances. Some pursued compensation through assemblies. Some were captured and absorbed into foreign cultures. Some raised sons who either perpetuated or quietly abandoned the raiding model. Some disappeared entirely from the historical record, but not from genetic legacy. And most simply continued. There's something profoundly human about that. No grand speeches, no heroic theme music. Just the steady decision to wake up the next morning and continue managing reality. So when we ask, what happened to Viking women after raids failed? The answer is not a single dramatic outcome. It is 1,000 small adjustments, a ledger rebalanced, a marriage negotiated, a field replanted, a child reassured, a winter endured, and eventually a society transformed. As the Viking Age faded into medieval Scandinavia, the loudest stories, the raids, the conquests became legend. The quietest stories, the women who held everything together when those raids failed, became almost invisible. But without them, there would have been no continuity, no stable settlements, no kingdoms of Norway, Denmark, or Sweden emerging from the chaos, no sagas written centuries later, just empty fjords and abandoned farms. So perhaps the real legacy of Viking women after failed raids is not tragedy, it's persistence. The kind that doesn't make headlines. The kind that keeps societies alive long after the ships stop sailing. And now, as the last ember fades, we let the shoreline go dark. The ships are gone. The wool is folded. The silver counted. The children asleep. And somewhere in the quiet of a northern night, a woman closes a wooden door, turns a key at her waist, and prepares for whatever tomorrow decides to bring. Sleep well.